Hello, everybody. So today I'm going to talk about a view that is known as effective altruism and give you sort of 6 reasons that I'm a fan, that I think it's good. And then at the end, I'll do a little bit of sort of practical kind of advice about like if you're interested in effective altruism or you think there's something right about what I've argued today, what do you do next? Where can you go from there? So cool. Let's jump in then. So first I just want to start with the question, what is effective altruism? Partially because maybe not everyone even has heard of this before, knows exactly what it is, but I think it's a really cool movement. If you haven't heard of it, you should. You should know about it. It's great. So here's basically what it is in a nutshell. Altruism, basically views that prioritize the well-being of others, helping others. The intuitive thought here is, right, we should help other people. I think almost everyone would agree with that, right? At least at some points in our lives, we should be concerned with helping others, concerned with their welfare, right? Okay, so that's altruism. And then the idea is that we should do that effectively, right? So what effective altruists or EAs do is they try to use reason and evidence to identify the world's most pressing problems, I think is a phrase they often use, and then from there, sort of pursue the most effective solutions. Of course, again, using reason and evidence to try to figure out exactly what the solutions are. So the intuitive thought here is that we should prioritize our limited resources efficiently, right? We have limited resources, time, money, etc. And so we should prioritize those to help as many people as we can, for example. Okay, so I want to talk about some of the common causes that effective altruists are often concerned with, but there's a caveat here, which is that I don't think you have to be concerned with all of these or have these all at the top of your priority list in particular in order to embrace the basics of effective altruism. And I think I'll maybe mention this again later, but I will say effective altruists, one of their big core values is reason and evidence. And so if there was a good argument or a good reason to think like, oh, there's actually causes that are more important than these, or these aren't so important, they're very open to sort of changing the causes that they focus on. But I will just say, in fact, the community tends to focus on these kinds of things. So helping the world's poor, that includes, of course, food, shelter, but also medical care, just many like preventable diseases like malaria are things that we can help people with for very cheap. And so really just helping people in need around the globe, I would say, is like maybe their most emphasized cause, if not one of the most emphasized causes. Okay. Number two is improving animal welfare. So there's actually a lot of really sad things that happen to animals, especially on factory farms, and a lot of them are trying to raise awareness about what goes on, how animals are treated in factory farms, prevent factory farming, encourage people to buy ethically sourced meat or go vegetarian. Many effective altruists are vegetarians. I don't think you have to be an effective altruist, but a lot of them do think there's a lot of stuff we can do to sort of help animals out. So that's like another common cause a lot of EAs associate with. There's also sort of just high risk problems, and they're not necessarily problems that are extremely likely to occur. Like they're not, it's like obviously there's people are just in poverty. Like that's just a fact, right? But is there going to be a worldwide nuclear war? Like that's an open question, right? But they look at not just what in fact is happening, but what could happen. What are the chances of that and how bad that would be? And so kind of like using a little bit of decision theory there to try to figure out, well, what are some high risk problems that are worth thinking about solutions to, even if there's some chance that they don't end up being problems, right? And I think that's actually a really good way to think about things, especially because with so many different things, we are in a position of uncertainty. And so we have to look at how bad something would be or how good something would be, and then what the relevant probabilities are. So things like preventing future nuclear fallout, right? Preventing runaway AI or AI safety. A lot of EAs are big on sort of researching these kinds of topics and then pursuing solutions to them, or doing things to make it less likely they occur, etc. Okay. There's a specific branch of effective altruism, which I will be talking about a good amount in this video, called Christian effective altruism. Another related organization I'll talk about as well is called Christians for Impact. And they additionally emphasize global missions, doing global missions effectively. And I think that's pretty cool. I think that's awesome. And then also another thing they think about is for people who are sort of drawn to effective altruism and this way of thinking, they provide career guidance. So what are good careers you could specialize in to effectively help others? How can you sort of use our careers? One of the biggest, our time, energy, like that's one of the biggest uses of our time and energy in our lives. And so they say, of course you can do something and then give money to these good causes or volunteer on the side, but it's also really great to have people with their careers that are centered around sort of helping others effectively. And so they offer career guidance for people drawn to that way of thinking. Okay, so that's effective altruism. That's some of the causes commonly associated with EA. Um, I want to now give 6 reasons that I think we should take effective altruism pretty seriously. And this is again going to be at least the more minimal view. We should help others effectively even if you don't necessarily agree with all the common EA causes. I think this minimal idea behind effective altruism is really intuitive and really important. Okay, so let's start. The first, what I basically just said, effective altruism is a pretty intuitive theory. So we should help others and do so effectively. I mean, there's not a lot to object to there. Of course, philosophers have their little quibbles about should we always save more lives rather than less and etc. But really, I think this is a pretty intuitive statement. It's going to be one that's hard for most people to deny. So not only is it just itself intuitive, it's often motivated, especially helping the world's poor, is motivated by this thought experiment from Peter Singer, where he says, look, you walk across, you're heading to work, you're walking to work, let's say, and you find a shallow pond, and there's like a toddler who is really struggling, looks like he's, maybe potentially drowning. You're not 100% sure, but he's kind of like struggling in the water and seeming to have trouble breathing. And you look for a babysitter or parents or anything, you don't see anybody. So it seems like he's alone, could be drowning, but you just got fancy new outfit for work. So you spent like 500 bucks on your suit, 300 bucks on your shoes, and you would totally ruin your whole outfit if you went in the pond to save this kid. And Singer says, look, even if it costs you $800, it's absolutely not just a good idea to save the kid, but it's your obligation to save the kid. You're doing something wrong if you just let the kid stay there because you don't want your suit to be ruined or your shoes. And so then the thought is, well, look, this is similar to the situation we're in with respect to the world's poor. There's a lot of people dying of malnutrition, preventable diseases like malaria, and we can save a life for, it's debatable in exactly how you measure save a life is debatable, but 800-ish, maybe a few thousand at the most, but we can drastically improve people's lives for way less, for like, in some cases, pennies, or dollars. We can drastically improve the lives of people that just aren't getting food or clean water or good medical care. And so he says, look, if you think you should save the drowning child, that also gives you a good reason to think it's not just nice to give to charity, but you actually should give to charity. It's some kind of moral obligation. And then there's, of course, a bunch of debates. How much do you have to give to charity? Singer thinks quite a lot. Some people think Singer's wrong and we should give to charity, but maybe not as much as Singer thinks. And, it's not a perfect analogy. I think there's, of course, differences between walking by a child drowning in a pond and giving to charity, but I think it does show that we have obligations to help other people. We should care about the problems in the world and helping the poor, and especially if we have a little extra. Some of us, have a lot extra, and some of us just have a little extra, right? But insofar as we're kind of living in excess, we have extra money, some of those resources should go to help people, whether that's giving money, giving time, or something else. Okay. So again, there's a lot of debate about how much the analogy holds up and whether it does or not. We go over all this in my applied ethics class. It's actually really fun. But I do think it's a compelling motivation to say I should be doing something to help other people. Okay. Um, so another way of putting this is I think it puts it pushes us, I think, intuitively a lot to think, well, helping other people or giving to charity, it's a nice thing to do, but if you don't, it's okay. And I think maybe we should think about it a little bit stronger than that. Actually, maybe giving to charity should be pretty high on our priority list. In fact, maybe it's something we should be doing. We all have a moral obligation to at least give some money to charity, right? And I'll say EAs too. They say when you're making very little money, even just trying to give 1% of your money to charity is kind of a goal they set. And, if you have a more stable job, they encourage something more like 10%, right? So, again, this doesn't have to be you giving 95% of your money away, but I think this pushes us to at least say doing something to help other people. In some cases, that could be giving time or something else. Although often money is actually going to be probably a more effective way to help people because you can send that overseas to places where it's most needed. So yeah, I think this analogy pushes us to think we should at least give some money to charity. We have a moral obligation to. Okay. And I think this sort of intuitiveness behind effective altruism fits very well with sort of the Christian moral teachings, the Christian tradition. So much in the Bible emphasizes giving generously, not hoarding wealth. I mean, there's so many warnings to rich people, especially rich people that put too much value in their money, rich people that, you know, like hold their wealth so tightly that they aren't willing to help other people with it. There's a lot of warnings in the Bible for people like that. And so we're called as Christians to give generously, and we're called to care for the poor and vulnerable. So James said that true religion involves helping widows and orphans. Jesus said, whatever you did for the least of these, you did for me, right? And I could have quoted 20, 30, 40, 50 other verses about this, right? But I think this sort of intuitiveness behind EA, we should help others, is very, very Christian. It's a very Christian idea. Okay. I'll talk more about the effectiveness. I actually think effectiveness is also something Christians should be pursuing. We shouldn't just throw our money at some random charity and regardless of whether it's really doing that much good or not, we should actually try to help people in an effective way. I think that's both just itself intuitive, but also I think there's something Christian about it, and I'll get to that in a second. Okay. Second, many of the controversial views associated with effective altruism are not essential. So if you've taken philosophy classes or heard about EA or listened to some of the podcasts I'm going to mention at the end, you'll know that effective altruism is often associated with a number of kind of controversial positions that philosophers reject, debate about, positions that many other people reject, debate about, maybe positions that people will say is inconsistent with Christianity. And so I want to say you don't have to accept most of these controversial views in order to be an effective altruist. Okay, so utilitarianism, that's the view that we should, or like morality can be summed up as something like this: pursue the greatest happiness for the greatest number of people, right? And then consequentialism is sort of a larger umbrella view under which utilitarianism falls, which says that like something like the consequences of our action are what determine whether the action is right or wrong. Okay. Both of these controversial moral theories, utilitarianism is going to be even more controversial because consequentialism, it's pretty neutral on what counts as consequences. It doesn't have to be happiness. It could be, a number of other things. But you don't have to really actually accept either of these to be an effective altruist, even though they're, of course, commonly associated with effective altruism, right? So you could be a deontologist or a virtue theorist, right? So really the three main views in ethics are consequentialism, deontology, virtue theory. And I think you could totally be a deontologist, effective altruist. You could totally be a virtue theorist, effective altruist. Because many of these people would agree, of course, we should help others and try to do so effectively, right? Um, and I even think this is a stronger claim. I don't think you have to believe this to be an effective altruist, but something like all else equal, we should save more lives rather than less. That is something most effective altruists are going to think, and I actually think most ethicists are going to think that, as long as all else is equal, right? Of course, if you're maybe not a consequentialist but some kind of deontologist, you might say, well, there are certain side constraints, right? Deontologists emphasize moral rules, and so they would say, never torture babies. That's just an absolute moral rule. Even if you could save 1 trillion lives, you shouldn't torture babies. That's totally consistent with EA. Of course, you can still say that and say all is equal, we should save more lives rather than less, but if torturing a baby is involved, not everything else is equal, okay? Um, and so I really think you can commit to the basic EA story and even some of the more, things like, again, keeping things equal, we should try to save more people rather than less. We should be efficient with our resources when we're helping other people. Those things are consistent with all three of the moral theories. So you don't have to accept utilitarianism or consequentialism to be an effective altruist. Okay. The next view is called long-termism. This is another view commonly associated with effective altruism. Basically says we should care quite a bit about the long-term future. So we should be thinking about not just our children or our grandchildren, but many generations beyond that, thinking about how can we best, take care of them, whether this means, taking care of our planet or, I mean, really the further out you get, the more speculative you get. And I don't even know if this is an objection to long-termism because they would agree, like, it can be really hard to predict how our actions are going to affect 20, 30, 40 generations down the road, right? But some effective altruists are very into at least trying to predict how our actions might affect those people. If, of course, population keeps expanding, there might be way more people. And so they think, look, we should try to do what we can to make the lives of those future people really good because their lives matter and because maybe there might be way more of them, right? So that's long-termism. And some EAs are very focused on the long-term future, but this isn't an essential part of being an EA. Some EAs like reject long-termism altogether or think, it's somewhat of a thing we should think about, but not at the top of the list. So really, you don't have to be a long-termist to be an EA. And I would say this is even, well, probably more EAs accept it rather than less. It's kind of even a live debate among EAs, the extent to which we should accept long-termism. Okay. And then the priorities, the ones I talked about 2 slides ago, I think, when I was explaining what EA is, you don't have to embrace all of these traditional EA priorities to be an effective altruist. You might be less passionate about animal welfare. You might have a specific view of animals on which maybe, there's a huge difference between humans and animals. So you're like, that's not as much of a priority for you. You might be less worried about AI. You might think that the risks associated with AI are not as big as people make them out to be, right? So there's really just a lot of these questions they're live questions. They're live questions even within the EA community. And EAs are very open to hearing arguments about which causes should be prioritized and which shouldn't, right? So part of what they want to say is let's help others effectively, but exactly what that boils down to, that is to an extent an open question, I think. And there is traditional priorities that a lot of them care about. And of course, I think they care about for good reason. And I care about a lot of those priorities too. But you don't have to agree with all those priorities or put them in the same order that they do in order to be an effective altruist. So, like I have on the slide, part of being evidence sensitive is the community is committed to switching these priorities if given sufficient evidence. So, most EAs are very into updating on new evidence. That's like a important value I think a lot of them hold. And so, like I said, if you give them evidence that they should be interested in different kinds of causes, at least based on their own values, they should be open to that. Okay, great. So second reason. So the third reason, this kind of comes back to the question about, okay, so as Christians, we should care about other people, but why the effective part? Why should we care so much about being effective? And I think part of what EA encourages, but part of also what the Bible encourages is a life of purpose and a life of stewardship, right? So we shouldn't just kind of like throw around resources randomly or, just like do something that you think might vaguely help some people, but really think about what we're doing and really try to steward our resources the best that we can. Okay. So like I kind of just said, we should use our time, money, and resources well, especially as Christians. I think both this is intuitive. I also think it's biblical. A couple verses: for everyone who has been given much, much will be demanded. For one who has been entrusted with much, much more will be asked, right? And so, insofar, like the more resources you have, the idea is like you need to be using those resources well. Much will be demanded from you if you have a lot of resources. This is from a parable Jesus told where the guy in the parable, but this is also supposed to be something like that God is saying to us at the end of our lives, well done, good and faithful servant. You have been faithful with a few things, and I will put you in charge of many things, right? And so again, being faithful with what we have, using our limited resources well, I think is something that's clearly in the Bible, clearly commanded as Christians. And so what EA does, it comes in and it helps identify where we can do the most good with what we have, using good evidence, using, evidential sort of resources, help us to figure out how can I take my resources and do the most good with them. So I think this aligns well with the Christian teachings about living intentionally and living for others. So I do think the effective part of EA is a very Christian thing. I think to say effectiveness shouldn't matter to Christians or shouldn't be a priority for Christians, I think is wrong. Okay, cool. That's number three. Okay, number four. I'm gonna try to go through these quickly just so this video isn't super long. EA is compatible with almost all Christian traditions. I would say almost all because there's obscure traditions that have weird commitments and I don't want to, I don't want to make too big of a claim, but I think the mainstream versions of, Catholic, Protestant, Orthodox, all of those are going to be compatible with EA. And it's really kind of this neutral methodology that you can adapt based on your values and convictions, right? And so Catholic, Protestant, Orthodox people might have different priorities in global missions, or of course, they're going to have different doctrines. They're going to be teaching people in the church, and there will be some differences. But I think the basic EA framework is one that absolutely all of them can accept. So EA doesn't require you to give up your theological commitments. It's not saying you have to commit to this very specific strand of Christianity, but I think it's really broadly compatible with all Christian traditions. Okay, so that's number four. Number five, I think this is really valuable. I think EA offers us practical guidance in Christian ethics. I think this is really important. And this is actually like kind of something that people complain about philosophy in general, is like it doesn't give us practical guidance. It's just debating about all these like really abstract questions that don't really matter. But part of ethics, and part of why I like when I teach ethics, I would do a lot of applied ethics, is because I think ethics actually does offer a lot of practical guidance. And Christian ethics in particular, I think EA can kind of step in and help us in Christian ethics to be more practical with kind of just like the guidance we're giving people. Okay. So we do have clear goals as Christians, ethical goals, right? Love your neighbor, care for the poor, seek justice, right? Those are all examples of things repeated in the Bible quite often. But the Bible doesn't always exactly tell us how to do that, especially in our modern world, in our complex world where there's different kinds of causes we can support, different kind of careers we can have, different things we can do with our time and money, right? And so, yeah, it's like love your neighbor, but what exactly does that look like? Care for the poor. Well, exactly can I do that? I think EA can offer answers. And so, like I said, it can kind of fill that gap. It can help us move from these general moral principles that the Bible teaches that are very important to concrete actionable steps. And then what's cool is like because EAs really value being evidence sensitive, we can then evaluate and even improve those steps, right? So we might try one way, realize that's not as good as we thought, and then maybe try a different way, right? So I think that's really cool to maybe make this a little bit more concrete. So instead of just saying help the poor or give money to the poor, EA asks which organizations actually help the poor most effectively. How can I give to the poor or help the poor in the best way possible? And then it also gives guidance about how to best support those organizations. Is it time, volunteering? Is it money? Is it, some other kind of donation, right? And oftentimes it's actually going to be giving money to organizations overseas. That's going to be where the biggest need is. And I think this is really cool and really helpful because it can help us effectively use our resources to fulfill the biblical command to give to the poor. Okay. Or instead of saying something like, do good things with your life, EA will say, what careers help you save the most lives? What careers help you reduce the most suffering? What careers help you effectively help other people, right? And so I think that's really cool. I'm going to give like even more concrete examples of where to look to find organizations or find this kind of career advice at the end. So I'm not going to leave you hanging there, but I think this is like a really, really useful resource and tool for Christians. Okay. So it's not just about doing something to help others, even though it's great if you want to do that, but it's about doing the most good you can. And EA helps you go from just doing something to doing the most good you can, or at least moving in the direction of doing the most good, right? It's always going to be a question of what's the most effective. And, um, you know, new causes, new charities are popping up. It's not going to, like always be this totally straightforward thing, but we can at least know we're supporting some of the most efficient charities out there, for example. Okay. Final reason, and then I'm going to go to it's like some more concrete resources if you like this effective altruism idea. I think it's a very helpful tool for Christian vocation. So, as Christians, part of what we want to do is serve God through our careers. We're trying to figure out what career should I have? How can I best serve God? I remember in college worrying a lot about like what's God's will for my life? What career does God want me to have? And I think these are really important questions, but it's hard to know what this will look like in practice. And what's cool about effective altruism is it helps us figure out how we can spend our lives in a way that genuinely helps others. And again, maybe this is part of being genuine, but it effectively helps others, right? Using there's this thing I'll talk about in a second called 80,000 hours, but we have about 80,000 hours of our lifetime we spend on our career. So using those 80,000 hours to actually not just do some random job that like you've got offered, but use those effectively to make a difference in the world, okay? So it can help answer questions like which of the world's problems are the most urgent, which are ones that are either like high probability to be a big problem or maybe not as high probability, but if they are a big problem, they'll make a really big difference. Where's the greatest need, right? Is the greatest need local? Often, actually, it isn't local. Often, the greatest need is actually going to be somewhere else. I know that can feel weird, like to just give money to some organization across an ocean and not physically see what's going on with it, but often that is where the greatest need is. And then also, what can I uniquely contribute based on my skills, opportunities, and calling? Right. And so there is a personalized element to this, and some of the resources I'll explain at the end can help with that. So, like I said, rather than just randomly taking like the first job that you're offered, EA encourages thoughtful, evidence-based discernment. And I think this helps us as we're trying to figure out how can I live with purpose? How can I make a difference with my life? How can I improve the world with my life? And that can look like really different ways for different people. Like some people do this thing they call earn to give. It's a really interesting concept, and the idea is like you find a high-paying job and then you commit to giving away every dollar over a certain amount that you make, right? Like, so I've heard of people, I actually heard I've heard it's better to commit to giving everything over a dollar amount than a percentage. But like one example I heard was of a couple that gave away 50% of their income. They were high earners, they both made a lot of money, and they could easily live on half their money. I think that's super cool. So that's one thing, but oftentimes like going to global missions or going into nonprofit work, being a part of these effective charities, that can also be a really effective way to help others as well. Okay. And I want to say too, like, this doesn't replace prayer. Like, prayer is important, asking God, like, what should I do, right? Or theological reflection, or reading the Bible. But it enhances those things. It gives us practical tools, practical guidance to sort of come alongside those things. And I think sometimes too, when we talk about like what God's calling us to do or God's will or like the Holy Spirit's guidance, we think that only happens through prayer or only happens through kind of like reading the Bible or something. But I totally think God and the Holy Spirit can use practical tools like effective altruism um, to help us with this kind of thing as well. So I think associating Holy Spirit calling you to something or moving in your life only with prayer and theological reflection, I think is wrong. I actually think God uses practical tools all the time to show us where God wants us. So, yeah. So yeah, to sum it up, I think EA can be part of discovering and living out one's God-given vocation, figuring out what God wants you to do with your life. Okay. So on that note, you might wonder, well, where do I start? Like effective altruism sounds really cool. Maybe you might be in college, you might be trying to figure out what do I want to do? Do I want to do grad school? Do I want to pursue a career? You might already have a career and say, well, how can I like bring these principles of EA in to like more effectively help others in my career? So where do I begin? Okay, so I want to give a bunch of tools. I will also try to put, I think should be able to put links to all these like websites and stuff in the video description as well. So you can check that out and just click the links quickly. But I do want to make some recommendations here because there's a lot of really cool stuff online. Okay, so first I want to start with some general EA resources. So, you might be watching this video, but you aren't as interested in Christian EA or whatever. You don't have to be a Christian to be an effective altruist. As a Christian, I do like the Christian EA spin on things, but there's a ton of general EA resources that are really great. I love a lot of these. So, of course, obviously, Effective Altruism website, they have resources, they link to a lot of these other websites, effective charities to give to, responses to common objection. They have conferences and meetups. So, effectivealtruism.org. So, definitely check that out. GiveWell is a nonprofit organization, and what they basically do is they seek to provide up-to-date information about the best places to give money. So you want to give some money to a charity and you want to do it effectively, GiveWell is a great place to start. They have like charity rankers and they'll say, here's some of the, here's a ranking of some of the most effective places, the charities that will do the most with your money. The Against Malaria Foundation is often, as I have on there, one of GiveWell's top-rated charities. So malaria is a common cause of death in developing countries, but it's a preventable disease and preventable for quite cheap. So a long-lasting insect net costs around $2. So you could possibly save a life for $2. That's pretty cool. So Against Malaria is a common one a lot of people will give to. And then I love the 80,000 Hours podcast. I will say the interviews often are very long. Some of them are like 45 minutes to an hour, but some of them are 3 to 4 hours. So you can listen to them in spurts or whatever. I'll like listen to them on long car drives or just, work through an episode slowly or whatever. But it's a really cool podcast, especially if you're interested NEA, they interview a lot of experts on like a ton of different topics from philosophy to political science to economics. It's like a huge range of different topics and basically just like the effective altruist perspective on a lot of topics. So long form interviews with experts, and then there's kind of how does your work affect EA or EA causes? So they might interview like a political scientist who works on nuclear warfare and talk to them about that. They have a lot of episodes about AI stuff, episodes about animal welfare, episodes about helping the world's poor. So I really like the podcast. Definitely check it out. You can access, I think the podcast is like anywhere where you can get podcasts. You just type in 80,000 Hours podcast. Oh, and 80,000 again, that's like the number of hours you spend in your career. So they're also really trying to help people figure out how to use their careers to help other people effectively. But also like there's a ton of stuff on their website too. Okay. So then I want to talk a little bit about effective altruism for Christians. So EA for Christians is an organization, and then they have kind of a sister organization, which is called Christians for Impact. So there's a bunch of really great resources here for like kind of the Christian perspective on effective altruism. So, okay, EA for Christians sort of basically considers themselves part of the EA movement, but they're specifically aimed at Christians who are interested in EA. There is some differences in the causes they emphasize. So EA for Christians talks a lot about global missions. The general EA doesn't as much, right? They have a website, tons of great info. Oftentimes, actually, when my husband and I are thinking about like where we might give to charity, I will use their website, like see the charities that they recommend. So they do have recommended charities. They have responses to objections not covered here. So like one article that I was like, I'm just remembering was like the woman who takes expensive perfume and like washes Jesus's feet, puts the perfume on him, dries it with her hair. It's like, that seems like a waste of resources. And then like, I think even that Judas says like, we should have taken that money and given it to the poor. And you might wonder, well, how does that story fit with effective altruism? So there's like an article about that, for example. I actually don't even remember off the top of my head exactly what the article said, but I do remember thinking it was like a really good article. So just like things that like come up like that, like, is that kind of story consistent with EA? Like, should we ever use resources lavishly like that, rather than just like pinching every penny to give to the poor, right? So definitely check out that website. And then Christians for Impact, like I said, it's like a sister organization. And they're kind of like 80,000 Hours, but a Christian version. And so they're trying to help Christians figure out how to use their careers effectively for Christ. So they have a podcast that I've listened to, lots of really great episodes that I've enjoyed on the podcast. And then just additional resources for Christians interested in EA. So there's their website as well. Okay, and then Christians for Impact specifically has a lot of really cool resources that I think are definitely worth highlighting. Okay, so they're focused on sort of young, ambitious, and analytically minded Christians. Doesn't have to be, but maybe, you're in university or recently graduated, or you just want to make a career switch to something more impactful. And of course, it can also apply even if you're going to be set on your career, but you want to try to figure out ways to help your life make an impact otherwise, right? So, um, they have tons of free resources, including a mentorship program I'm going to talk about in a second. Most of the mentors they offer in the US and the UK, but their resources, of course, otherwise can be accessed by everyone. I will say their podcast is really great. They have conversations with sort of Christian experts. A lot of their Christian experts are either explicitly or implicitly, kind of effective altruists. And so they talk about, like they'll have people doing global missions or global medical missions, some really, really cool interviews that I've really enjoyed. And if I remember right, they're often not like 4 hours long. They're like a little shorter. So, but definitely check out their podcast. But then I really also want to highlight two more resources they have. They have this 10-minute career guide. So if you're like, this is cool, but I just need something quick, check out their career guide. I'll post a link to it in the description. It has 7 career tips if you're kind of interested in Christian effective altruism. There's job boards and career resources, and I think they even send out an email. I think it's maybe monthly, where like there's just like lists and lists and lists and lists of job openings that are kind of like effective. Yeah, basically like effective ways you can serve others and like things a Christian might be interested in or attracted to. And then they have sort of 3 big questions to ask yourself as you're sort of like thinking about career stuff. So check out their career guide and then definitely check out their mentorship program. I think this is super cool. It's 100% free. And it's just a really good way to have someone sit down with you and give you personalized advice about how you might use your life for Christ, how you might use your career for Christ. So what they do is they match mentees with a Christian specialist in their field of interest. And for a one-time call, I've actually done one of these calls before as a mentor. And so you kind of like, you can jump on Zoom or maybe a phone call and just talk to the mentor, like, what's your job like? Here's my, background, my interests, like, what do you think? Like, what are my next steps? What should I do? And so it's such a cool, valuable program, and it just can really help you connect with someone in your field of interest and your field of expertise. So it's not going to be like a long-term, like regular meeting thing, but I still think it's a super, super helpful thing and it's totally free. So the mentors provide guidance, they can pray for you, they can link you to job, research opportunities, etc. So definitely recommend checking that out. Again, I will put links to all of this stuff in the description, but I hope this video was helpful for people. I hope this video, you learned a little bit about EA and also learned about some of the resources available. All right, have a good day, everyone. Talk to you later.